In this video, I want to show you some of the video options available within the Polymega console. Alright everybody, the Polymega is a very interesting type of box. Even though it uses emulation, it's not doing the traditional up-resing of the game's internal resolution as seen in other emulation boxes like the PS Classic or Retron 5 or anything like that. This is just straight up native internal resolution being upscaled to 1080p. Now that might be hit and miss with some people, but for me personally, I absolutely love this approach. It's a very accuracy-based approach, so it's just absolutely in my wheelhouse for the type of thing I like to see. But that does lead to some interesting looking gameplay if you're not used to this sort of thing. Like, you just get the native low-res assets on PlayStation 3D games especially, and it can look very odd to some people on a modern display. If you've played a lot of emulation in the past and you don't really up-res, like, you're used to this, probably, but there are a couple things to go over to improve this a bit. We're going to start with Metal Gear Solid here, but if you press the home button on your Polymega controller, there's a couple things to go over here real quick. So I want to go into the video settings page real quick, and there are two options available. There is 1080p at 120 Hertz and 1080p at 60 Hertz. So this 120 Hertz mode is actually really interesting. This is going to be great for games that ran above 60 Hertz. So for example, NES, SNES had interesting refresh rates that were slightly above 60, if I recall correctly. So 120 Hertz mode is a great way to display those. So you can change that here in this menu. Now there is one more option down here at the bottom to enable HD Temporal Blur. And this is an option specifically useful for 480i content, so games like Chrono Cross that have 480i menus. You'll notice the screen flickering in games that utilize 480i with this option off, so you can turn it on to try to reduce the appearance of that. Unfortunately, in my opinion, this option kind of makes 240p content look a little bit odd, so I personally leave this off unless I'm doing 480i content and the flickering is bothering me, but for the most part, I do leave this option off. But once you have your output resolution and frame rate set, you can go into the virtual display option, and it's actually how you're going to implement filters for your games. So up at the top of the screen, you have the controls on how to change things. So up and down on the D-pad will adjust the filter. So we've got just your standard non-filtered HD image at 1080p. So if you press up, it'll add in a CRT type geometry curve here. Then we have an RGB filter. So this is trying to more closely mimic a PVM or something like that. Looks pretty good. Then you could also enable the curvature for that mode as well. Next we have an RGB filter plus a slight blurring filter. This helps eliminate some of the jagged edges on these games. So as you can see, there's really helps to take some of the edge off. But it looks pretty good. A little bit darker, but we'll go over that here in a second. So moving on, we also have the RGB filter plus curvature and the blur for just trying to mimic more accurate experiences. And the last one we have here is a composite type filter. So this is trying to more closely mimic your consumer CRT. And now personally, I am quite fond of this mode actually. It's a little bit softer than I typically prefer, but it really works well here. And especially if you're sitting back from your display, like, it looks really good. And this mode actually looks really good in a number of different games, not just 3D ones. And I will give you examples of this here in a second, but for me personally, this has been my go-to when using the Polymega. Like, it looks really good. It looks really clean, really clears up the image, and honestly, I didn't expect it to look this good. But going back into the display, there are a few more options available to us. So if we press up one more time, this will actually change the display output into 720p. Now you might be asking yourselves why you would want to display at 720p instead of 1080p. And the answer is a little bit complicated, but basically it comes down to your TV. If you're playing on a 4K TV, some of them can scale 720p images better than 1080p images, and 720p also has a nice 3-time multiplier integer scale versus 1080p having to basically run in a 960p window if you want to have proper scaling. So this will actually fill up your screen a little bit more if you're not using the zoom setting. But depending on your display, that's going to be really the determining factor if you want to use 1080p or 720p. But then we also have the curvature, RGB, Rgb blur, Rgb blur plus curvature effects available within 720p. Unfortunately, 720p output does not have that composite filter. But I'm just going to go back over to composite real quick. Alright, so next up we have aspect ratio. By default, Polymega is in this standard 4:3 zoomed aspect ratio. So this takes your integer scaled image and then kind of stretches it to fit your display. Can result in some shimmering in side scrollers. So if you press right on the D-pad, you could go to standard 4:3. So this is your 960p integer scaled image. But as you can see, it results in black borders around the top and bottom of the screen. Some people don't mind this like myself, others really don't. This is where that 720p mode comes in handy. But then you could also do square pixels or stretch the entire game out to 16:9. So some people like to stretch their games out, some don't. Some games actually do have anamorphic widescreen where this 16:9 mode is really good. For example, Panzer Dragoon 2. But you can choose which one you like and go from there. Now, if you notice, there is a next button if you press X. And this lets us adjust the brightness of our display. So by default, it should look like this with composite video filter enabled. That's a little too dark for my taste, so I crank this up to 1.2 or 1.3 personally. 1.2 is usually the sweet spot for me, and it gives you just the nice filtered image without making it too dark. And if you press X again, you're able to adjust the position of your X and Y axis depending on which aspect ratio you're using. With the standard 4:3, I can't change this, so it's grayed out as you can see here. But if we were to go back to that, we can adjust it here. So you can see we can move the offsets around to just really change it how we want it. But I'm going to go back to standard 4:3. And once you have your filter set, you can save this on a per game basis or as a system-wide default. So if you press start on your controller, it'll save this setting for every game in that console library. Or if you just want to save it for the game on hand, you can press A. So I'm going to save this as my PlayStation default. Alright, now just for another quick example here, I want to show you Mega Man X4 on the Sega Saturn. I really like the Sega Saturn version of X4, but it does have a few visual oddities compared to the PlayStation version. So as you can see, the searchlights are checkerboarded instead of actual real transparencies. So if we go back into our virtual display settings, we're on just the standard output setting of the Polymega here. So first thing I'm going to do is just integer scale it back down to standard 4:3, so it's 960p within the 1080p frame. And I'm going to start applying my virtual filters here. So as you can see with the RGB setting here, it doesn't quite scale right for Mega Man X4, so we end up with this improperly scaled image for this particular filter on this game. This isn't the case for all games, it's just you need to really see it game by game. But if you adjust it to square pixels, it does fix that filter up in this regard, but again, that's not quite accurate in the display setting, but whatever. I mean, it fixes it if you wanted to use this particular filter. Well, mostly fixes it. It's still slightly off, but not too major. But anyway, let's go back to standard 4:3. So the blur filter does help a bit, and then the curvature blur filter definitely helps out quite a bit for this one. And that's a little bit more proper of a display output for X4 if you're using the RGB filter. But if you decide to use the composite filter, which again is my personal favorite on this system, you can see that X just looks a heck of a lot more smoothed out, a little bit more detail in them, and those searchlights look a little bit more like real transparencies, as would happen on a consumer CRT back in the day. So again, these settings are all going to be personal preference, and I just wanted to give you kind of a brief rundown of them. Again, I am loving this composite filter. I didn't think I would. Like, I don't typically like these softer images in emulated games. Normally I'm all for the full-on pixel art look of it, but I don't know. Having been messing around with the RetroTink 5X as of late, and now these filters within the Polymega, I'm absolutely loving the softer look, more detailed scan lines, and just the blended art, the way it kind of was supposed to look back on these TVs. And it looks really good in motion too, like there's just no denying that. I really hope that YouTube compression doesn't destroy this too much. I mean, you probably won't see the scan lines as well, but I'm hoping that the smoothed out art really shows through. But for those of you looking into the Polymega, I hope that this brief overview of the display options that are currently available has been interesting for you. I'm sure we will see more updates to this as the Polymega proceeds through its life. There have already been a few added in, like the 720p modes that didn't come with the system at launch of the beta units, but they are available now. That's going to do it for this one. Big thank you to everyone who has stuck around and watched this video. It really helps out the growth of our channel and allows us to make more content just like this for all of you. But now I have a couple of huge favors to ask. If you haven't already, please be sure to hit that like or dislike button, just depending on how much you like today's video. And if you haven't already, hit that sub button so you can see when new videos go live on the channel. Lots of Polymega content in the pipeline, as well as my normal reviews and tutorials and other random nonsense I like to put up. And for those of you who might be interested in further helping support the channel, you can also check out that join button here on YouTube or the Patreon link in the bottom right hand corner of the screen. A little goes a long way to helping us keep this place up and running and bringing content just like this to all of you. Big shout out to all of our current champions. You all have been such amazing rock stars to us over the last number of years, and we just cannot thank you all enough. But that's going to do it for this one, so until next time, my wonderful internet peeps, you all stay awesome, and we will see you all back next video.